All right, welcome. This is Steve Yee, Product Manager for SQL Azure.
And I'm Faisal Mahmood, Program Manager on the Entity Framework team at Microsoft.
Okay, so what we're going to cover today is actually programming using .NET against a SQL Azure database, and we're going to be using the Entity Framework today. So, Faisal, what is the Entity Framework?
So the Entity Framework is the recommended data access technology in the .NET framework for relational data access. It's important because it gives you capabilities like object relational mapping and very simple way to get data in and out of the database with very high productivity and very few lines of code. So that's why the Entity Framework is important. And the other reason why it's important is because it plugs into the rest of the .NET and the Microsoft stack. So building applications that are integrated with ASP.NET or with WCF become easier than they would otherwise be.
Okay. So in other data access frameworks, normally you would go through steps saying specifying a connection, opening the connection, and then doing your query, and then closing the connection. How is EF different, or what problems does it solve in simplifying those things?
The EF solves this. The EF solves the problem of the mismatch between the kind of view you want to have in your application versus the kind of view that exists in your database. So what you often want is to just be able to say, go fetch me customers that meet these characteristics. And so instead of worrying about the query that you are going to run on SQL Server, you're just focused on exactly describing what you want to get out of the database and what conditions you want specified. And they come back to you as objects, and you can manipulate them, you can save them back, and you're not worried about tracking changes to the things that may have changed.
I see. So how much of the t-SQL language do you have to know to successfully query the database using EF?
You don't have to know any of it. In fact, where we are going with the Entity Framework is you don't really have to know any t-SQL. Of course, if you did know t-SQL and wanted finer-grained control, then you should be able to. And so those are the kinds of things we're working on. But you don't really have to have any knowledge of t-SQL to use the Entity Framework effectively.
Okay, that's great. So in the simple example that you're going to show us in a moment, how many lines of code does it actually take to query a record?
I think it's between, it's either 2 or 3 lines of code. Don't know off the top of my head, but I think once I go through my demo, you will really see how simple it is, because all you're doing is really just writing a link query and sort of just executing that query.
Okay. So Entity Framework basically creates an entity model of the database.
Yep.
And there's a way to actually recreate it from an existing database.
Yep.
But what you're going to demonstrate in just a moment is actually the reverse, where you're creating a model first.
Yes.
Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. So in the first version of the Entity Framework, we really focused on making sure that you can easily bring a model that's already in the database so that you can program against it, because there are a lot of scenarios where you're building applications against an existing database. But it's also true that many applications that you're building might not have a database. And so often what you would end up doing would be to create the data model up front, deploy that to the relational database, and then start writing code. What we wanted to do with Model First was give you a first-class way of doing modeling, in the conceptual layer, so you could go and use the Entity Designer to build out your model, and not worry about how it's created on the database. You can simply tell the designer to generate a database for you from the model, and so even if you have things like inheritance in your model, the Entity Designer would sort of take care of mapping that back to the relational model.
Okay.
And so that's what Model First is all about.
Got it. So it looks like you prepared a short demo for us to take a look at.
Yes.
All right, so let's actually dive into this.
Okay, sure.